The aerial photographs showed nothing, just kilometers of Ukrainian steppe, gentle slopes, and the occasional tree line. But Generaloberst Hermann Hoth kept returning to the same image, his finger tracing invisible lines across the grainy black-and-white paper. The lamp in the field headquarters cast long shadows across the table where a dozen officers stood in silence, studying what should have been their final obstacle before Kursk. "Where are the fortifications?" his intelligence officer asked, breaking the tension. "Exactly," Hoth replied. This was the paradox that haunted the German High Command in the hours before Operation Citadel. They had assembled 800 panzers, the largest armored formation in history, for a single knockout blow. They had Tigers, Panthers, and Ferdinands, machines that could penetrate 100 millimeters of armor at 2 kilometers. Behind those steel monsters waited another 200,000 men, veterans of Warsaw, Paris, and the drive to Moscow. The entire offensive doctrine of the Wehrmacht had been distilled into this moment: overwhelming force applied at maximum velocity against a single point. It had never failed, but the reconnaissance photos showed an enemy that had seemingly vanished into the landscape. No trench networks visible from 3,000 meters, no concrete pillboxes casting shadows in the early morning light, no artillery emplacements carved into the hillsides, just empty steppe that rolled on like a sea of grass, innocent and undefended. The intelligence officer shifted uncomfortably. "Perhaps they've withdrawn to secondary positions, Herr Generaloberst. Traded space for time." Hoth didn't answer. He'd fought the Soviets for 2 years. He knew they didn't surrender ground without soaking it in blood first, which meant the fortifications were there, somewhere, hidden in a way that aerial reconnaissance couldn't detect and forward scouts hadn't survived long enough to report. They didn't know they were staring at a masterpiece. 80 kilometers to the north, Captain Viktor Antonov sat in an underground command post that didn't appear on any photograph. He wasn't watching the horizon, he was watching a stopwatch. Around him, the walls were covered in hand-drawn schematics showing what the Germans would see, nothing, and what they would find, everything. Minefields laid in patterns that funneled armor into designated corridors, anti-tank guns concealed in earthworks that looked like natural terrain from above, concrete firing positions built into the reverse slopes of hills, invisible until you crested the ridge and found yourself staring down the barrel at point-blank range. Antonov hadn't built walls that could be photographed from the air. He had built a labyrinth that could only be understood by dying inside it. The ditches were too shallow to cast shadows. The bunkers were covered with sod that matched the surrounding grass. The kill zones were measured in meters, not kilometers, because that's where German armor doctrine would collapse. When the tanks that owned the long-range fight were forced into knife-fighting distance with an enemy they couldn't see until it was too late. In less than 6 hours, 800 of the Reich's finest machines would learn the difference between a fortress you can see and a trap you can't escape. Before we descend into the inferno of the Iron Graveyard, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more visceral accounts of World War II's most brutal clashes. Drop a comment below with your location and the time you're watching. Let's see how far this community of iron and history stretches today. This is the story of the day the Blitzkrieg met the wall of concrete, and why the men who invented armored warfare never recovered from the lesson. The conference tent smelled of diesel and stale tobacco. Karl-Heinz Witt stood among 24 panzer commanders, all of them staring at the same thing. Photographs that showed absolutely nothing worth dying for. The Luftwaffe reconnaissance officer had laid out 73 images across the map table, each one capturing a different sector of the Soviet defensive line. Or what should have been a defensive line. Here, the officer said, tapping a photograph with his pencil. Sector 7. We estimate this is their primary belt. Witt leaned forward. He saw grassland, a slight depression in the earth that could have been a ravine or a shadow. Nothing that resembled the concrete fortifications they'd shattered at Sevastopol or the trench networks they'd bypassed at Kharkov. And here, the officer continued, moving to another image. Sector 12. Heavy concentration of... well, we're not certain. Not certain of what? Someone asked. Not certain of anything. The terrain analysis suggests defensive preparation, but we're seeing no above-ground structures, no firing positions, no vehicle tracks leading to fortified points. A major from the 11th Panzer Division spoke up, his voice tight. They've had 3 months to dig in. Where are the damn fortifications? The tent fell silent. It was the question that had been circulating through the ranks since yesterday's final briefing. The Red Army had known about Operation Citadel since April. They'd moved 500,000 men into the Kursk salient. Soviet prisoners had confirmed the presence of multiple defensive belts, some extending 30 kilometers deep. Yet, from the air, it looked like they'd built nothing at all. Perhaps that's the point, another commander said quietly. Perhaps we're meant to think it's empty. Witt straightened, his jaw set. He'd been fighting on the Eastern Front since Barbarossa, had driven his Tiger from the gates of Moscow to the streets of Kharkov. He'd watched Soviet tanks burn by the hundreds and seen their infantry break like wheat before the scythe. The absence of visible fortifications wasn't terrifying, it was insulting. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice cutting through the murmur of speculation. "With respect to our reconnaissance comrades, I don't care what we can't see from 3,000 meters. I care about what we can destroy from 300. We have Tigers, we have Panthers, we have the finest armor doctrine ever conceived, and crews who've proven it from the Atlantic to the Volga." He placed his gloved hand flat on the photographs, covering them. "The Soviets are farmers and factory workers playing at war. If they've hidden their defenses, it's because they're weak. If they've scattered their forces, it's because they're afraid. Either way, it doesn't matter. When we cross that start line at dawn, we are the storm. We are what breaks things. And if they've built something out there we can't see..." He paused, meeting the eyes of each commander in turn. "Then they'll die in it before they ever see us coming." The tent erupted in approval. Officers nodded, their doubts momentarily suspended by the certainty in Witt's voice. This was the faith that had carried them across Europe, the belief that German steel and German will were sufficient answers to any question the enemy could pose. Only the reconnaissance officer remained silent, staring at the photographs Witt's hand had covered, at the nothing that might be everything. Viktor Antonov sat 12 feet below the surface of the steppe, in a room that didn't exist. The command post had no windows, no periscopes, no opening to the sky that might catch the glint of morning sun and betray its position to a reconnaissance pilot. Just reinforced concrete walls, a single oil lamp, and a stopwatch resting on a hand-drawn map that showed what the Germans would never photograph. He wasn't watching the horizon. He was watching time. 0437 hours, 23 minutes until the barrage was scheduled to begin. Around him, telephone lines ran through conduits to firing positions scattered across 8 kilometers of apparently empty terrain. Each line connected to a gunner who sat in darkness, waiting for Antonov's signal. Above ground, the steppe looked untouched. Below ground, it was a machine. The stopwatch ticked forward. Antonov closed his eyes and saw winter. January. The ground frozen so hard it shattered pickaxes. Then 15,000 civilians from Kursk and the surrounding villages, bundled against wind that cut through wool like it was paper. They'd worked at night because German reconnaissance flights owned the daylight. No lights, no fires, just the rhythm of shovels biting frozen earth and the whispered commands of engineers who'd learned to navigate by starlight. They didn't dig trenches. Trenches showed up on aerial photographs as dark lines scoring the landscape. Instead, they excavated firing positions into the reverse slopes of hills, positions invisible from above, revealed only when you crested the ridge and found yourself staring into the muzzle of an 85-millimeter gun at 30 meters. February. The concrete arrived in horse-drawn carts because trucks left tracks. They'd mixed it in the dark, poured it in the dark, smoothed it in the dark, in bunkers that sat flush with the earth, their firing slits angled to create overlapping kill zones that covered every approach the terrain allowed. The roof of each bunker was covered with 18 inches of sod, transplanted from the surrounding steppe, watered until the grass grew back thick enough to look natural from 3,000 meters up. March. The minefields. Not scattered randomly like the Germans expected, but laid in geometric precision. Channels that looked safe, that led armor exactly where Antonov wanted it, into corridors where the tanks would be compressed, slowed, and exposed to fire from 3 sides simultaneously. The mines themselves were buried just deep enough to be invisible but shallow enough to detonate under 40 tons of moving steel. April. The final layer. On dummy positions built on the forward slopes where the Germans expected to find defenses. Empty bunkers with no guns, designed to draw fire and waste ammunition, while the real positions remained silent and hidden. An entire theater of war constructed to make the enemy fight shadows, while the real killing happened from angles they couldn't anticipate. The stopwatch read 0441. Antonov opened his eyes. Above him, the first rays of dawn were touching the steppe. The grass swayed in the morning breeze, innocent and empty. Somewhere to the south, 800 engines were starting. He could feel them more than hear them, a vibration in the earth that traveled through 12 feet of soil and concrete to reach the room that didn't exist. He picked up the telephone receiver. His voice was steady. All positions, final weapons check. They will come with the sun. The line clicked as each gunner acknowledged. 12 weeks of labor, 8 kilometers of invisible defenses. And now, just waiting. The silence before the storm met the wall. The ridge came up like a wave, and for a moment Karl-Heinz Witt could see everything. 800 panzers stretched across the steppe in a formation so massive it seemed to curve with the horizon. Tigers in the vanguard, their long 88-millimeter barrels elevated for maximum range. Panthers behind them, faster and lighter, ready to exploit any breakthrough. And in the rear, the Ferdinands, 70-ton monsters with armor thick enough to laugh at anything the Soviets could throw back. The sun rose behind them, casting their shadows forward across the grassland. It felt biblical, like they were made of light, and the enemy ahead was nothing but darkness waiting to be burned away. Witt's Tiger crested the ridge at 0523 hours. His gunner, Ernst, already had the sight picture he needed. A slight depression in the terrain 3 kilometers ahead, the exact position reconnaissance had flagged as a probable defensive concentration. "Target," Witt said into the intercom. "Suspected bunker, range 3,000. "Identified," Ernst replied. His voice was mechanical, professional. He'd done this 200 times before. "Fire." The 88-millimeter shell left the barrel at 1,000 meters per second. At this range, it could penetrate 165 millimeters of vertical armor plate. At this range, it had never met anything it couldn't kill. Witt watched through the cupola as the shell crossed 3 kilometers of empty air in less than 4 seconds, and watched it impact exactly where Ernst had aimed. Then he watched it bounce. The shell hit something and deflected skyward at a 40-degree angle, tumbling end over end before disappearing into the morning haze. Not an explosion, not penetration, just a ricochet that left a white scar on something that hadn't been visible a second before. "Was machst du?" Witt snapped. "What are you doing?" "I hit it, Herr Hauptmann. Dead center." Ernst's voice had lost its mechanical certainty. "I don't understand. It should have—" Another Tiger fired, then another. Witt watched their shells strike the same area, each one producing the same result: white scars on gray concrete that seemed to rise from the earth itself, angled at exactly the slope needed to shed kinetic energy like water off a roof. The radio net exploded. Multiple commanders reporting the same phenomenon: shells bouncing, invisible fortifications revealing themselves only when struck. Concrete positioned where it had no right to be, where reconnaissance swore there was nothing but grass. Witt felt something shift in his chest. Not fear, not yet, but confusion, the kind that comes when the rules stop working, when physics decides to change sides. "All units," he transmitted, forcing his voice to remain steady. "Continue advance, close to effective range. They can't hide from us at 500 meters." But even as he gave the order, he was doing math he didn't want to complete. If they'd hidden this much concrete at the forward positions, what waited deeper in the defensive belt? If they'd built fortifications that reconnaissance couldn't detect and long-range fire couldn't penetrate, what else had they built? The Tiger rolled forward down the reverse slope of the ridge, 800 machines following, the mechanical tide that had never been stopped, now advancing into terrain that had somehow learned to fight back. Behind them, the sun continued to rise. Ahead, the steppe swallowed them whole, and the grass closed over their tracks like water. Which defensive innovation shocked you most? Soviet concrete engineering or the scale of the minefields? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from history's greatest battles. The first mine detonated at 05:47 hours. A Panzer IV from the 6th Panzer Division, its left track evaporating in a fountain of earth and steel. The tank slewed sideways, blocking the path of 2 machines behind it. They diverted right, into terrain that looked identical to what they'd just left. 30 meters later, another explosion. Then another. The mines weren't scattered. They were surgical. Vasily Sokolov watched it happen through a firing slit barely 6 inches wide. His anti-tank gun sat in a concrete emplacement built into a hillside that didn't look like a hillside, positioned to cover an approach that didn't look like an approach until the Germans were already committed to it. He'd been ordered not to fire. Not yet. Just watch as the minefields did their work. The panzers were learning the rules. Mines to the left meant go right. Mines ahead meant find another route. They were being trained, like dogs learning an invisible fence, and they didn't realize the fence was hurting them. From his position, Sokolov could see the entire geometry of the trap. The minefields formed corridors, channels of apparently safe ground between belts of buried death. The German commanders were making the logical choice: follow the paths that didn't explode. But those paths narrowed, 200 meters wide at first, then 150, then 100. The massive armored formation that had crossed the ridge in a wave was being compressed into columns, tanks forced closer together, their flanks exposed, their ability to maneuver stripped away, meter by meter. "They're coming to us," whispered Dmitri the loader. He was 19 and had never fired a shot in combat. His hands shook as he held the armor-piercing shell. Da, Sokolov replied. That is the point. 400 meters away now. The lead Tigers were still firing at suspected positions, their shells bouncing off concrete they couldn't see or missing entirely, hitting earthworks that revealed themselves only after impact. The Germans were fighting ghosts. Every time they thought they'd found a bunker, every time they adjusted fire to hit what they thought was a target, they were wasting ammunition on decoys Antonov had built specifically for this purpose. 300 meters. Sokolov could see the commander of the lead Tiger standing in his cupola, binoculars raised, trying to identify the source of fire that hadn't come yet. The man looked confident, like he believed the worst was over, that they'd broken through the outer defense, and now it was just a matter of pushing forward. 200 meters. The kill zone. Sokolov's position was one of 18 anti-tank guns positioned in a crescent along this sector. All of them hidden, all of them silent, all of them aimed at the narrow corridor the minefields had created, the funnel that held 40 German tanks in a space designed for 10. Sokolov's hand moved to the firing mechanism. His gun captain's hand stopped him. Not yet. Let them all enter. When they're committed, when turning back, means driving through their own formation. The captain smiled, but there was no joy in it. Then we closed the door. 150 meters. The Tigers were so close, Sokolov could hear their engines, could see the heat shimmer rising from their exhausts. The commander was still standing in his cupola, still scanning with binoculars, still looking for an enemy he wouldn't see until the muzzle flash. The telephone beside Sokolov's position rang once, Antonov's voice, calm and precise. All guns. Fire at will. Sokolov pulled the trigger, and the hillside came alive. The smoke turned day into twilight. Ernst was screaming about the jammed turret, his voice climbing into registers Witt had never heard from him before. The driver kept the Tiger moving forward because forward was the only direction left. Behind them, 3 Panthers had collided, trying to reverse through a corridor that was never wide enough for retreat. Through the cupola, Witt watched a Panzer IV ram its own squadron leader. Not intentionally. The commander simply couldn't see through the smoke and burning oil, couldn't hear the warnings over the radio net that had become a single sustained scream of overlapping voices. The impact was almost gentle, 10 kilometers per hour, 2 machines kissing in the fog. Then a Soviet shell hit the space between them, and both tanks erupted. The temperature inside Witt's Tiger was climbing. The engine compartment was overheating, pushed beyond its limits. The ventilation system was pulling in smoke that tasted like copper and burned rubber. Ernst was sobbing now, trying to manually traverse the turret with the hand crank, but the mechanism was either damaged or the sheer weight of the gun was too much for human strength to overcome. "We have to bail out," the driver said, his voice surprisingly calm. "Herr Hauptmann, we have to abandon vehicle." Witt looked through the vision slit. Outside, the world was steel and fire. A Ferdinand had thrown a track and sat motionless while its crew tried to escape through the hatches. They made it halfway out before a machine gun, another invisible position, another angle they hadn't anticipated, cut them down. The bodies hung from the hatches like abandoned puppets. "We stay," Witt said. "Outside is death." "Inside is death," Ernst replied. And he wasn't wrong. The Tiger lurched over something. Debris or a body or another tank. Witt couldn't tell. The smoke was so thick now that visibility was measured in meters. A shape materialized to their left. Another Tiger, but it wasn't moving. Its hatches were sealed. Witt couldn't tell if the crew was dead or just frozen with the same calculus he was running, that opening a hatch meant immediate death, but staying sealed meant slow suffocation or cooking alive when the ammunition finally cooked off. A shell hit their right track. The tiger slewed sideways and stopped, the engine still screaming but the machine no longer moving. They were stationary, in a kill zone. Inside 60 tons of steel that had transformed from the most powerful weapon on Earth into a metal coffin with a jammed turret and no mobility. Ernst had stopped sobbing. The silence from him was worse than the screaming. "Engine shut down," Witt ordered. "Preserve ammunition. We wait." "Wait for what?" the driver asked. Witt didn't have an answer. Through the vision slit, he could see other tigers, other panthers, other machines of the great offensive, all of them stopped or burning or locked in place by terrain that had seemed passable until it wasn't. The minefields had compressed them, the concrete had channeled them, and now the kill zone was simply processing them, one tank at a time, with the methodical efficiency of an assembly line running in reverse. The radio was quieter now, not because the situation had improved, but because fewer voices remained to transmit. Someone was praying in broken German. Someone else was calling for his mother. And beneath it all, the steady percussion of Soviet guns firing from positions that revealed themselves only through muzzle flash and then disappeared back into the earth like they'd never existed at all. Witt reached up to open the cupola hatch. Ernst grabbed his wrist. "Don't." They sat in the darkness, breathing smoke, waiting for the shell that would end the waiting. Luka Voloshin was 22 years old and weighed 53 kilograms. In the world of burning steel and thunder, this made him invisible. He crawled on his belly through grass that had been trampled into mud by treads wider than his shoulders. The satchel charge strapped to his back weighed 8 kilograms, canvas bag packed with TNT, and a friction fuse that gave him 12 seconds between pull and detonation. 12 seconds to place the charge against the engine compartment of a Panzer and crawl far enough away that the explosion wouldn't turn him into red mist. The tiger to his left was still running. He could hear the engine, could feel the heat radiating from the exhaust vents. The crew was buttoned up inside, sealed in their armor, blind to anything below their sightlines. Luka was below their sightlines. He was beneath their world, moving through a landscape they couldn't see even when they were looking directly at it. Smoke helped. The entire battlefield was choked with it, burning tanks, smoke generators the Germans had deployed in desperation. The dust kicked up by 800 machines tearing the steppe apart. Luka moved through it like a fish through dark water, staying low, staying patient, waiting for the moments when the Soviet guns paused to reload. A Panther sat 15 meters ahead, engine silent, track blown. He could see German infantry sheltering behind it, using the dead tank as cover. 5 men, maybe 6. They were scanning the smoke for Soviet infantry, for threats at eye level. Luka crawled past them at ground level, close enough to hear their breathing, close enough to smell their fear. They never looked down. The mathematics of the sappers' war were simple. Anything taller than 1 meter would draw fire. Anything moving faster than a crawl would be seen. But a man flat against the earth, moving slowly. He covered in mud that matched the churned steppe. That man could walk between raindrops. He reached a Ferdinand that had thrown both tracks trying to turn in terrain that wasn't meant for turning. The crew had already abandoned it, leaving the hatches open. Luka didn't need a satchel charge for this one. He pulled himself up the glacis plate, slid through the driver's hatch, and wedged a thermite grenade into the ammunition storage. The grenade would burn hot enough to cook off the shells, and the shells would turn the Ferdinand into a self-made funeral pyre. He was back on the ground before the fuse even started hissing. The next Tiger was alive, but trapped. Engine running, main gun traversing left and right, like a blind predator searching for prey. Luka crawled beneath it, between the tracks, into the shadow, where the hull met the earth. He could hear voices inside, muffled German, frantic, arguing about something, orders to advance, mechanical failure, the impossibility of their situation. He placed the satchel charge against the engine deck, directly over the fuel tanks, pulled the friction fuse. The chemical igniter sparked to life with a sound like tearing paper. 12 seconds. Luca crawled forward, not backward, away from the tank toward the next one. Behind him, the German voices continued, unaware that they were already counting down. At 8 seconds, he was clear of the blast radius. At 0 seconds, the Tiger's fuel tanks ignited, and the engine compartment became a furnace. The crew had maybe 30 seconds to evacuate before the ammunition cooked off. Some made it, most didn't. Luca didn't watch. He was already moving toward the next shadow, the next dead angle, the next giant that would never see him coming. In the world of steel titans and screaming engines, he was a ghost, and ghosts were winning the war. The shell came through the turret at 16:47 hours. Whit didn't remember the explosion, just the sudden silence that followed, and the realization that he was lying in grass that hadn't been there a moment before. His Tiger was 20 meters away, burning with the efficient intensity of a crematorium. He'd been thrown clear through the cupola hatch. Ernst and the driver were still inside. He tried to stand and discovered his left leg wouldn't cooperate. Not broken, he could feel it, just unwilling to bear weight. He crawled instead, away from the burning Tiger, into the maze of metal that had once been an army. The graveyard stretched in every direction. Panthers with their turrets blown off, sitting like decapitated monuments. Panzer IVs burned down to their chassis, just skeletal frames and road wheels. A Ferdinand tilted at 45 degrees in a crater that shouldn't have been there, its long gun pointing uselessly at the sky. Some of the tanks were still smoking. Others had already cooled into sculptures of defeat. Whit walked between them. Limped, really. One step with his good leg, then dragging the bad one forward. The smoke was thinner now. The battle moved elsewhere or simply exhausted. He could see the full scope of the disaster. Not hundreds of tanks, hundreds of coffins. The mathematical certainty of German armor doctrine reduced to arithmetic. 800 machines had entered the kill zone. He could see at least 300 from where he stood, and he was only looking at one sector. The bodies were worse than the tanks. Crews who'd bailed out and been cut down by machine gun fire. Men burned beyond recognition, frozen in positions that suggested they'd died trying to escape their own armor. A panzer commander still sat in his cupola, apparently untouched, until Whit got close enough to see that everything below the man's chest had been sheared away by a shell. He found water in the canteen of a dead lieutenant, found bread in a supply bag that had been thrown from a burning half-track. He ate and drank mechanically, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were showing him. This wasn't a battle. It was a slaughter, and he'd survived it only because statistics required that someone survive to tell the story. The Soviet scout appeared at 1820 hours, emerging from behind a destroyed Panther like a ghost coalescing from smoke, young, maybe 20, carrying a rifle but not aiming it, just walking through the graveyard the same way Whit was, documenting the dead. They stared at each other across 10 meters of churned earth. Whit's sidearm was still holstered. The scout's rifle hung loose in his hands. Neither man moved to raise a weapon. What would be the point? The war had already made its judgment. The outcome was no longer in question. The scout said something in Russian. Whit didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. Exhaustion, recognition, the mutual acknowledgement of men who'd just witnessed something that transcended nationality. They'd both been taught that superior tactics, superior machines, superior will could overcome any obstacle. The field around them was proof that all three doctrines had died together. Witt gestured at the landscape of wrecks. The scout nodded. No translation necessary. They were standing in the cemetery of an idea, the belief that armor and speed and violence of action could solve any problem the enemy presented. The concrete and the mines and the hidden guns had answered that belief with physics, and physics had won. The scout turned and walked away, disappearing back into the smoke. Witt watched him go, then continued his own walk through iron. Behind him the sun was setting. Ahead, more wrecks stretched toward a horizon that seemed impossibly far away. He'd come here believing he was the storm. Now he knew better. He was just a man who'd driven into a trap that geography and patience had built for him. The storm had been waiting in the earth all along. Share this story with someone who needs to know that the greatest victories aren't always won by the sharpest sword. Sometimes they're won by the deepest trap. The reconnaissance aircraft flew over at 0630 hours on July 6th, the same altitude as the flight 2 days prior. The pilot carried the same camera, followed the same flight path, photographed the same sectors. But the images that came back to headquarters showed a different world. Where there had been empty steppe, there were now 800 black scars. Burned-out hulls arranged in patterns that told the story of their death, clusters where tanks had collided in smoke, long lines where entire columns had been caught in crossfire, solitary wrecks scattered across minefields like tombstones in an unplanned cemetery. The photographs were so dense with wreckage that intelligence officers initially thought they were looking at multiple overlapping images. They weren't. This was a single afternoon's work. In his underground command post, Viktor Antonov studied his own map, the one covered in pencil marks and calculations, the one that showed every hidden gun position, every minefield corridor, every angle of fire that the Germans had discovered only by dying. He took a red grease pencil and wrote across the entire sector. Cleared, June 6th, 1943. Cleared. As if the 800 tanks had been an infestation, as if German armor doctrine had been nothing more than a problem requiring the correct application of engineering and patience. Above ground, Soviet engineers were already moving through the wreckage, cataloging what could be salvaged. A Tiger's transmission here, a Panther's road wheels there. The armor that had been designed to conquer continents was being reduced to spare parts and scrap metal. Some of the hulls were so thoroughly destroyed they'd have to be cut apart with torches before they could be moved. The tactical reports were conclusive. Operation Citadel had failed, not delayed, not set back, failed. The German offensive had lost its momentum in the span of 18 hours, broken against defenses that reconnaissance had sworn didn't exist. The Panzerwaffe, which had conquered Poland in weeks and France in days, had been stopped by concrete they couldn't see and ground that refused to cooperate with their doctrine. 20 years later, in the memoirs that German commanders would write from retirement, they would try to explain it. Generaloberst Hoth wrote that the Soviet defenses at Kursk represented a fundamentally new approach to warfare, the weaponization of terrain itself. Field Marshal von Manstein, who planned the offensive, admitted that we had prepared for a battle against an army. We encountered an army that had become landscape. But the most honest assessment came from an unnamed panzer officer, recorded in a post-war interview. We were taught that speed and armor could overcome any obstacle. At Kursk, we learned that some obstacles are built specifically to kill speed and armor. We drove into a trap that had been designed, tested, and calibrated using our own doctrine as the blueprint. They knew exactly what we would do because we'd spent 5 years teaching them, and when we finally did it, the ground simply swallowed us whole. The steppe returned to grass within a year. The wrecks were hauled away or buried, But the lesson remained, written in the language of 800 dead machines. Blitzkrieg works when the enemy fights where you expect them. When they turn the earth itself into a weapon, when they make physics and patience and concrete into a doctrine that answers speed with stillness, the storm breaks. And the men who believed they were unstoppable learned that they were only fast. Antonov folded his map and filed it away. The verdict was in. The Iron Graveyard had delivered its judgment, and history would spend the next 80 years studying the corpse of a doctrine that died in a single afternoon.